I still remember the night before everything changed, when the Pacific Ocean looked calm on the surface, but the air above it carried something that gnawed at my nerves. Have you ever looked at the sky so long that you started to wonder if it was staring back at you? That night, stationed on a Japanese vessel moving in silence toward destiny, I felt like the stars were too close, like they were watching. But one of those lights was not a star, and I knew it. Before Pearl Harbor became a scar in history books, there were whispers, flashes in the sky, and shadows moving faster than any aircraft we had ever seen. That is where my story begins, not with the bombs, but with the lights. And if you are hearing me now, I invite you to stay with this memory, subscribe, and keep asking questions, because history is not always what your teachers told you. Sometimes history hides in the clouds. When I first enlisted, I believed war was a simple thing. Uniforms, weapons, flags, and orders. But by 1941, it was already obvious that war was something far stranger. You can call it political ambition, or imperial expansion, or American oil embargoes squeezing Japan like a vice. All of that is true. But under the surface of every headline there was tension, almost supernatural in its weight, as if something beyond human hands was stirring the pieces on the board. I am not the type to jump at shadows, but that night the shadows were real, and they moved like hunters across the horizon. The Pacific is vast. You do not understand its emptiness until you are out there with nothing but salt air in your lungs and an ocean that could swallow empires under your feet. Yet even in that emptiness we were not alone. I spotted a formation of lights hovering where no aircraft should be. They were not stars, because they shifted in patterns too precise, too deliberate. They were not American bombers, because no engine noise followed them. They glided, pulsed, then vanished, only to reappear at impossible angles. If you think I was hallucinating, I ask you this. How could the other men see them too, pointing, whispering in the kind of fear soldiers rarely admit? One of the older petty officers muttered a word under his breath. Tengu. In Japanese folklore, Tengu are sky spirits, tricksters, sometimes protectors, sometimes demons. But I knew enough about airplanes to say what I was seeing had nothing to do with birds or spirits carved from myth. These objects, whatever they were, belonged to a different category entirely, and yet, like so many soldiers of that era, I swallowed my questions, because questions were dangerous in a time when obedience was survival. Still, history forces you to connect the dots. Pearl Harbor was only hours away, and here I was, staring at lights that made no tactical sense. Did they belong to the Americans, testing secret technology? Or did they belong to someone else entirely, watching the clash of nations as a kind of experiment? It is easy today, in the age of smartphones and satellites, to assume we have answers. But in 1941, we had only our eyes, and what my eyes saw has never left me. Think of it this way. Imagine you are driving down an empty desert road at night. No cars ahead, no headlights behind, just you and the silence. Then, out of nowhere, orbs of light descend in perfect formation, stopping without a sound, then vanishing into the darkness faster than you can blink. You would question your sanity, your safety, maybe even your purpose in that moment. That is what it felt like, only magnified by the knowledge that war was about to erupt. The officers ordered silence, told us to focus on the mission. But even the mission itself, sailing toward Hawaii in secret, felt like part of a larger stage play where unseen actors pulled the strings. We were told the Americans were blind, distracted, unprepared, and yet if these lights belonged to no one we knew, then perhaps somebody else was watching all of us, weighing us like pieces in a game we could not even see. When I close my eyes, I still see those movements in the sky. Not chaotic, not random, but organized, as if they were mapping something or signaling. I thought about the stories told in Shinto shrines, of kami descending from the heavens to guide or to punish. To the Western world, these might be angels or devils. To scientists, they might be extraterrestrial probes. But to me, a young sailor with salt crusting my lips and fear pounding in my chest. They were simply proof that humanity was not alone on that ocean. Some of the younger men joked nervously, calling them fireflies of the gods. Others crossed themselves in the way Christians do, though Christianity was not common among us. You see, even in the heart of the Imperial Navy, superstition thrived, because war itself is superstition made real, humans convincing themselves that blood sacrifices could buy victory. And when you throw unknown lights into that mix, belief becomes survival. I wish I could tell you I never saw them again. But the truth is, that was only the first of many sightings. The lights came and went, as if marking our progress toward Hawaii. I began to wonder, were they leading us or warning us? The answer never came. But in that silence, the seeds of doubt were planted, and once you doubt the official story, you never stop. Looking back, I cannot separate Pearl Harbor from those lights. They belong to the same memory, fused together like smoke and fire. When the bombs fell, when ships burned, when the sky turned into a storm of metal, I still thought of those quiet, watching orbs. And I still wonder which was the greater threat, the planes that screamed down upon us, or the silent watchers who made no move to intervene. The morning after those lights over the Pacific, the deck smelled of steel and brine, a mix that clung to our uniforms like an omen. My hands were still trembling as I checked my rifle and radio equipment, going through motions drilled into me by years of training. The memory of those silent orbs refused to fade, and yet no one spoke of them openly. We all had been warned about rumors. In the Imperial Navy, rumors were considered a kind of treason, like cracks in the hull that could sink morale. But rumors still flowed, whispered between shifts, drifting like cigarette smoke across the deck. They were not just about enemy ships or aircraft. They were about shadows in the sky, objects that had been spotted for months by different crews, moving in ways no known plane could. As a soldier, you learn to separate myth from fact. The Japanese command framed the coming strike on Pearl Harbor as a surgical blow, a thunderclap that would cripple American power in the Pacific. But we, the rank and file, felt the tension of something else moving under the surface. Every time we loaded torpedoes or polished the barrels of the ship's guns, there was a sense we were playing a part in a performance whose script we had never read. And when the lights reappeared 2 nights later, moving in patterns like geometric tattoos across the sky, I began to suspect that our war was not entirely ours. You might think I am exaggerating, but history records strange phenomena around battles. The Romans wrote of shields of fire in the sky before conflicts. Medieval soldiers told of ghostly armies appearing on the horizon. Even in America, long before radar and satellites, there were reports of airships crossing the Midwest in the 1890s. Some historians dismiss these as mass hysteria, but living through it changes the calculus. It is one thing to read about a strange light in a dusty book. It is another to stand under it, hearing nothing, feeling its presence like static on your skin. Our captain tried to impose normality. Orders came down in crisp, coded messages, filled with phrases like maintain heading and silent running. But the men had seen enough to doubt. One engineer swore he saw a metallic glint inside one of the orbs, as if it contained a craft rather than being a light itself. Another said the objects interfered with his radio headset, filling it with bursts of high-pitched sounds like flutes. I pretended not to hear them talk, but my mind catalogued every detail like a historian in real time. The Pacific in wartime was an arena of secrecy. Every side tested new weapons, new strategies, new codes. America had its cryptographers at Station Hypo. Japan had its spies in Hawaii. But nothing in our manuals mentioned lights that could outpace a Zero fighter without sound or exhaust. Some of the younger sailors theorized that the Americans had developed a spirit weapon, something beyond our comprehension. Others whispered about the Germans, who were rumored to be building miracle machines in underground bunkers. But a few, the quietest among us, wondered aloud if the sky itself had opened. That idea was not entirely alien to Japanese thought. Shinto shrines teach of kami descending from the heavens, and imperial ideology wrapped itself in celestial metaphors. Even our national flag, the rising sun, suggested a cosmic destiny. But the objects we saw did not feel like protectors or omens. They felt like observers. You can laugh, but the sensation was almost clinical, like being dissected by a gaze you cannot see but can feel. I began to connect these sightings to something larger. Months before, near the South China Sea, a sister ship had reported strange echoes on its primitive radar equipment. At the time, Command blamed atmospheric anomalies. But when I read the incident report, the coordinates lined up eerily with our current course. It was as if we were moving through a corridor mapped not by us, but by someone or something else. From a strategic standpoint, this raised terrifying questions. If the Americans or another power had such technology, why had they not used it to strike us directly? If it was not human, what was its purpose? Were these beings, if beings they were, interested in the outcome of our war, or merely in the spectacle of it? The thought gnawed at me during long nights on watch. It changed the way I looked at our mission. We were told we were the spear of the Emperor, but perhaps we were just data points in a larger experiment. There is a rhythm to military life, even at sea. Meals, drills, maintenance, sleep. Yet woven through that rhythm was now an undercurrent of unease. Every time a watch shift ended, new rumors sprouted. A cook said he saw one of the lights dive into the ocean and not emerge. A gunner claimed he heard a humming from below deck when no machinery was running. These accounts never made it into official logs, but they became part of our living memory, the secret history beneath the official one. What fascinated me was how quickly belief adapted. Men who had mocked religion began to pray. Others who had never spoken of science began to speculate about worlds beyond ours. In a way, those lights forced us to confront the limits of our worldview. Even as we prepared for war against a flesh-and-blood enemy, our minds were drifting into cosmic territory. It was as if the Pacific itself had become a mirror, showing not just our ships but our smallness against a backdrop of something vast. And so the whispers continued, as steady as the waves. By day we polished brass and recited orders. By night we watched the horizon for more than just enemy silhouettes. I would lie awake in my bunk, listening to the creak of the ship, tasting salt on my lips, and wonder whether history would ever acknowledge what we had seen. Wars are written by the victors, but who writes down the parts that do not fit? Who records the watches above the battlefield? The official histories will tell you Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack, a masterstroke of planning. That is true. But beneath that truth is another layer, a subterranean current of experiences no one wanted to put on paper. I am one of the few still alive who remembers not just the bombs, but the silent orbs, the strange geometry above the Pacific. If you are listening, know this. War is not only about what men do to each other. Sometimes it is about who else is watching. When the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the sky itself seemed to split open. Flames, smoke, and screaming metal replaced the eerie silence of those nights at sea. I was young, but not so young that I failed to recognize the weight of that moment. We had trained for this strike, rehearsed it until it became muscle memory. Yet when the attack began, all I could think of were those lights that had hovered above the Pacific like silent judges. It was as if the heavens had given us a preview, then retreated, leaving us to our human violence. The battle was deafening, but in my mind I still heard the absence of sound from those orbs. Pearl Harbor is remembered today as an act of treachery, the day that drew America into the war. From the Japanese perspective, it was portrayed as necessary, a preemptive strike to secure resources and cripple a powerful enemy. But history often reduces events to neat explanations, stripped of the chaos that surrounded them. Standing on the deck during that attack, I realized that history is not written in lines, but in layers. The official version was about geopolitics, oil embargoes, imperial ambition, naval strategies. Yet beneath those causes lurked questions that had nothing to do with politics. Why had we seen what we saw? And why did it follow us into one of the most decisive military operations of the 20th century? I will tell you what troubled me most. During the chaos of the attack, when planes roared overhead and bombs shattered the calm waters of the harbour, some men swore they saw flashes of light above the battle that did not belong to any aircraft. I do not mean the glint of sun on metal or the flash of exploding fuel. I mean spherical lights hovering just beyond the reach of anti-aircraft fire, holding their positions with uncanny stillness. The American gunners aimed at our planes, not at the lights. It was as if neither side could acknowledge them, even though some of us could not look away. After the war, scholars would argue about radar failures, about intelligence lapses, about who knew what and when. But I have always wondered if the real secret of Pearl Harbor was not in the war rooms, but in the sky. Imagine this: the most advanced militaries of the world clashing in a battle that would change global history, while unknown observers hovered above, silent and untouched. It reminds me of gladiators fighting in the arena, while the audience, unseen in the shadows, watches for sport or for study. When history meets the unexplainable, we are forced to rethink the very categories we rely on. Was it divine intervention, as some claimed later in hushed voices? Was it evidence of technology so advanced that our minds, shaped by propellers and piston engines, could not comprehend it? Or was it perhaps a reminder that human wars are small dramas on a much larger stage? Religious men among the crew whispered about Amaterasu, the sun goddess, watching the empire rise and fall. Christians spoke of angels observing the folly of men. Skeptics muttered about atmospheric illusions. But none of those explanations satisfied the gnawing sense in my chest that something intelligent was present, and that it had chosen not to intervene. You see, intervention is what gives meaning. To watch and not to act is something else entirely, something colder. Looking back, I cannot help but see parallels with modern life. Today, we have satellites that can read license plates from orbit, drones that hover unseen above battlefields, and algorithms that watch our movements online. We live under constant observation, but we rarely notice it until it interferes. The difference is, in 1941, the observers were not ours. They were not Japanese, not American, not German. They were something outside of our categories, and that made them unbearable to think about. I remember one specific moment during the attack. A Japanese Zero streaked overhead, its machine guns rattling, and an American ship below erupted in flames. Amid the smoke, I caught sight of a sphere of light, stationary, unaffected by the chaos around it. My body froze. It was not fear of bullets or bombs. It was the sense that we were insects fighting under the microscope, while the scientist above simply adjusted his lens. That thought has stayed with me longer than the memory of explosions. Historians will tell you Pearl Harbor marked the beginning of America's full-scale entry into World War II. That is correct. But what they do not include is the haunting possibility that our history intersected, however briefly, with something outside human history altogether. You can call it coincidence, but I call it intrusion. Our timelines overlapped, like two rivers crossing. And when rivers cross, they leave eddies, whirlpools, disturbances that cannot be erased. In the years that followed, I would hear stories from American soldiers as well. During Guadalcanal, some Marines spoke of Foo Fighters, strange glowing objects that tailed their planes. In Europe, Allied pilots saw the same. We were enemies in uniform, but united in bewilderment by what we saw in the skies. The phenomenon was not national, it was universal. That, to me, suggests something deeper than propaganda or rumor. Even so, most veterans remained silent. War already scars the mind, and to speak of lights in the sky risked ridicule or worse. But silence does not erase truth. The unexplainable has a way of seeping back into the cracks of memory. Decades later, I still taste the salt of that morning, still smell the burning oil, and still see that orb of light hovering above the carnage. If you ask me what mattered more, the destruction of the Pacific Fleet or the presence of those watchers, I cannot give you a simple answer. One was visible, measurable, catastrophic. The other was subtle, intangible, but perhaps even more significant. Wars end, nations rise and fall. But the question of who else shares the sky with us does not fade. It grows louder with time, and so I live with both memories, the roar of bombs and the silence of lights. One is etched into every history book. The other survives only in the whispers of those who dared to look up. Together, they form the truth of that day as I lived it, a truth that history alone cannot contain. Years after the war ended, I would sit in small smoky bars in Tokyo or on quiet benches in Honolulu and watch the younger generations laugh without knowing the weight that hung over their sky. To them, Pearl Harbor was a date in textbooks, a black and white photograph, a speech by Roosevelt declaring a day of infamy. For me, it was not just the roar of explosions or the glare of fire on water. It was the silence before, the presence above, the unanswered question that still echoes in my bones. History remembers battles, but memory clings to mysteries. And the greatest mystery of Pearl Harbor is not why it happened, but who else might have been watching. In the years following the attack, governments buried themselves in intelligence, espionage, and propaganda. Japan sought to secure its empire in Asia. America surged with industrial might, transforming itself into the arsenal of democracy. The world split into battle lines, yet in the midst of these grand strategies, there were quiet reports that never reached the headlines. Pilots on both sides spoke of strange lights tailing their planes. Submarine crews claimed they saw glowing objects descending into the sea. In the Pacific theater, men were already drowning in fire and salt water, and yet some swore their last sight was of something bright hovering just beyond reach, as if marking the moment of death. If you think this is superstition, I understand. War creates hallucinations. Exhaustion bends perception. But if that is the case, then why were the reports so consistent across oceans, across nationalities, across enemies who would never conspire together? When American pilots in Europe called them Foo Fighters and Japanese sailors in the Pacific whispered of sky spirits, they were describing the same phenomenon in different languages. History tends to smooth those stories out, dismissing them as distractions from the real events. But maybe those so-called distractions were the real story, the one we refused to see. Standing in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, I began to see the battle differently. It was a tragedy for the Americans, a temporary triumph for us, but above all, it was a stage play. Human beings, armed with our crude machines, were fighting for dominance of an ocean. But above the smoke, beyond the gunfire, there were watchers who did not interfere. That is what haunts me. Not that they attacked, but that they observed. Observation is colder than war. At least an enemy who strikes you acknowledges your existence. But a watcher, silent and detached, reduces you to a specimen. As I aged, I tried to study what I had witnessed. During the occupation years in Japan, American archives began to fill with classified files. Whispers of Project Sign, Project Grudge, and eventually Project Blue Book circulated. Pilots reported glowing discs. Radar operators tracked objects moving faster than any jet. Scientists debated weather balloons, plasma, or psychological stress. None of those explanations satisfied me because I had seen the same pattern decades earlier over the Pacific, the night before history shifted. The echo of Pearl Harbor is not just political. It is existential. America emerged from the attack more united than ever, determined to crush the Axis. Japan pushed forward, only to be devastated by firebombings and the atomic bomb. Empires collapsed, borders changed. A new world order was born. But through all that blood and fire, the question of the watchers never left. Were they studying us? Were they waiting for us to develop weapons powerful enough to interest them? The thought chills me more than any battlefield memory. Because if they had been there in 1941, silent and distant, then where were they in 1945, when the sky itself burned over Hiroshima? Did they watch the mushroom cloud with the same detachment they showed above Pearl Harbor? These are not the kinds of questions you find in official documents. They live in the minds of veterans, in the gaps of history, in the uneasy silence between what we saw and what we admit. Even now, as governments slowly declassify reports, as pilots in modern jets speak of unidentified aerial phenomena, I hear the same undertones. The watchers have not left. They are part of the background of human conflict, appearing at the edges of our greatest tragedies. To me, the lesson is simple but unsettling. Human beings think of themselves as masters of history, shaping destiny through war, politics, and technology. But perhaps we are only participants in a larger experiment. Perhaps our wars are not just human tragedies, but also cosmic data points. When I think of Pearl Harbor, I no longer see just ships and planes. I see lights above the horizon, silent, steady, watching with a patience beyond comprehension. That is the true echo, the memory of being observed without understanding why. I do not claim to know the truth. Maybe they were secret weapons. Maybe they were illusions of exhausted eyes. Maybe they were visitors from another world. But I know what I saw, and I know I was not alone in seeing it. If history chooses to forget, memory does not. And my memory tells me that Pearl Harbor was not only a clash of nations, but also a moment when the human and the unexplainable collided. So I leave you with this. Next time you look up at the night sky, think of that December morning when the world changed under fire and steel. Imagine orbs of light hovering silently above, untouched by war, indifferent yet deeply present. Ask yourself, what does it mean to be watched? And who exactly writes the history of those who are observed? If this story stirs you, if it makes you question the neat lines drawn in textbooks, then stay with me. There are more memories, more shadows, more truths that history has left in the margins. Subscribe, share this story, and keep asking the hard questions. Because only by looking up, as I did on that vast Pacific night, can we begin to see the full picture of our past and maybe our future.